Benissimo, allora se non ci sono altri commenti di chiusura del secondo intervento, sì, diamo la parola a Neil Thompson. So, please, Neil Thompson, you can start your presentation. We are all very happy to listen to you. Please.
Thank you very much. Can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay.
Right, okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to be part of this conference. I'm very pleased about that. So thank you very much. I'm just sorry that I can't make the presentation in your beautiful language. At school, I studied French and German, but unfortunately didn't have the opportunity to study Italian. So we're stuck with English, I'm afraid. I wanted to start off by telling you a little bit about my background in terms of internships, or as we call them in my country, practice placements. When I was a practicing social worker myself, I supervised a number of students. When I was a team manager, we regularly had students in my team, and I played a part in supporting the supervisors in that. I've also been involved in training student supervisors for many years, and I've also published on the subject of student supervision and practice placements. What I want to look at in this presentation are 9 elements that I've found to be very significant during my time in terms of looking at student supervision. What I've seen over the years are some examples of really good practice, but also some examples of placements going wrong. And often that's because there was a lack of preparation. So I want to look at some key issues that supervisors need to be able to prepare for and be able to address as effectively as they can. Now I don't know whether you can see my PowerPoint presentation, but I can't. So has that moved on?
Yes, we can see your slide.
Yes, okay. Yeah, so I think the first thing that I wanted to emphasize is what needs to be part of the preparation is to make sure that the team where the student will be based is welcoming of that student. Unfortunately, I've come across many situations where a social worker in a team was keen to supervise a student and volunteered to the local university to do so, but without informing their team or seeking the permission of their colleagues. And as a result of that, the student hasn't been fully welcome in that team. It has created tensions in the team, which then gets the placement, the internship off to a very bad start. It creates difficulties, potential conflicts, and of course, students will normally pick up on those tensions. They will detect that they are not fully welcome in that placement. So I think that's the first thing in terms of preparation, is to make sure the team concerned are able and willing to provide the placement, that it isn't just the wish of a single social worker to act as a supervisor. Then what's also important, as I see it, is a committed supervisor. I'm not sure how things work in your country, but in the UK, being a student supervisor or practice educator, as they're also called, is something that brings a bit of status and prestige. And so sometimes things can go wrong because the social worker who was offered to be a supervisor has done it for the wrong reasons. They've done it because they expect to get some sort of status or prestige, but without necessarily being committed to putting in the work, putting in the effort, being prepared to be fully supportive of the student. They can perhaps see it as a shortcut to some status or prestige. So it's important when planning a placement that it's very clear that the supervisor is fully committed and is not just seeing it, as I say, as a shortcut to some degree of status or prestige. Then a third thing that I think is really important in terms of preparation is an appropriate learning agreement. That this agreement needs to be clear and explicit and tailored to the student's needs. Unfortunately, a lot of supervisors seem to think that just having the student with them in their team for a certain number of weeks will be enough to meet the student's needs. So what is offered is just a general learning experience. And of course, what's needed is much more than that. There needs to be clarity about what are the specific learning needs of the student in terms of their experience, their stage in their degree program, and their level of confidence. In my country, in the UK, that is very significant because we can have some students who have got years of pre-course experience. That is, before they started training to be a social worker, they had worked in some sort of social service role, and so they have got lots of experience to draw on. They're perhaps mature students who are quite confident, but alongside them, we will also have 18-year-olds who are attending university to learn how to be social workers, who have got little or no experience of issues to do with social work. So treating those two types of student in exactly the same way is going to cause problems. There needs to be a learning agreement that is tailored to the specific needs of the student. So there's a lot of preparation that has to go into that to just give the student general opportunities to learn will certainly not be enough in terms of producing a quality learning experience. What I've found in terms of the learning agreements as well is that the students need to be encouraged to think through their own learning needs. And this is a particular interest of mine because something I've been promoting for quite some time now is the importance of self-directed learning. If we think about learning, most learning opportunities are managed by somebody else. When a student goes to university, they didn't decide the curriculum. They didn't decide the teaching methods. Someone else did that. When a social worker, for example, goes on a one-day training course, they didn't decide what was going to be covered on the course. They didn't decide how the course was to be presented. So in general terms, people's learning tends to be governed by other people. And that can be effective much of the time. But what's much more effective in my experience is where students are helped to work out what are their own specific learning needs and to take responsibility for that learning. So this needs to be an important part of the preparation in terms of a learning agreement. And I say this because I've come across many situations where students will try and disengage from the process. So when they're asked by a supervisor, for example, what is it you want to learn from this placement, what they will often say is something very vague and general. Something like, oh, well, whatever it is you're able to teach me, or I want to learn about how your team works. And of course, that's not going to produce optimal results. It's essential that the learning agreement that is set up is specific to the student's learning needs. And the student, of course, needs to play an active part in determining what those needs are. And as I say, that can be a difficult process because students will often try and opt out of it. Okay, then next is an effective induction. And I like to talk about the who and the what of induction. Unfortunately, a lot of students arrive on day one of the placement and are just given work to do without any real understanding of how the organisation works, who the key people are that they need to relate to, what the specifics are of the work they're going to be doing, and so on. So what you end up with is a student whose initial anxieties are amplified at the beginning of the placement, not reduced. And that, of course, then acts as an obstacle to learning when those anxieties become something that holds the student back in terms of being able to be confident about the work they're going to be doing under supervision. So preparing an induction package is therefore, to my mind, an essential part of preparing for an effective placement. It's, as I say, I don't know about in your country, but certainly in the UK, this is a common problem that students are not given a proper induction package. They may be just given minimal information and expected to just adapt to the situation they're in, which, as I say, causes a lot of problems. Next, there is regular reflective supervision. And I think all three of those words are very important, and I'll take them in reverse order. First of all, there is the supervision, and some people unfortunately just see supervision as literally overseeing of the student. So they will do little in terms of helping the student learn, for example. They will do little to address any concerns the student may have. Their primary concern is often defensive. And what I mean by that is they will be held responsible for any problems the student may create. So if the student makes mistakes, if the student behaves unethically, if the student does something that is against the organization's rules or policies, then of course the student has some degree of responsibility themselves, but there will also be an expectation that the supervisor has some responsibility. So if you're not careful, what happens is supervision becomes reduced to just literally overseeing the student and his or her work. And then the reason I say reflective is because that supervision needs to create thinking spaces. It needs to give the student the opportunity to reflect on what they're doing, why they did something this way rather than that way, why they drew on a particular piece of knowledge or theoretical perspective rather than another one. Where things have gone well, why did they go well? What was it that was done that produced a positive result? If things don't go too well, what can be learned from that? What can be done differently? And supervision should be an ideal opportunity to draw out the learning from the experience for the student. So the supervision needs to be reflective in that sense. It needs to create what I like to call thinking spaces. In other words, the opportunity to stop, reflect on what's been happening, take a step back from it, review things, and also an aspect of reflective practice that is often neglected is the idea of reflection for action. So there's been much written and talked about in terms of reflection in action and reflection on action. But something that I've written about is the gap in terms of reflection for action. In other words, planning. That students will often be very anxious, and understandably so, and being in a position to think ahead, to plan for what might happen in a particular situation, in my experience, can remove much of that anxiety and also put the student in a much stronger position in terms of producing good practice. And then the third word in that title is regular. And I think this is important as well, because social workers are generally busy people. And what that can mean in some circumstances is that they don't have space in their diary for regular supervision, that a lot of time can pass without a proper reflective supervision session. And again, that can create unnecessary anxiety. If the student is not understanding something or is practicing in a problematic way, then regular supervision needs to be taking place to try and address those issues before too much harm is done, either to the student or to the people that the student is working with. So in terms of preparation, one of the things that I've been teaching student supervisors to do for many years now is to decide on a regular time for supervision and to put that in their diary for throughout the period of the internship. So if it's a 3-month placement, for example, and they decide to do supervision every Thursday morning, for example, then that should be blocked off in their diary before the internship starts, so that that space is reserved for the student. Because one sort of side effect, if you like, one consequence of not having regular supervision is that the student can start to feel that they're a nuisance, they are an inconvenience to the supervisor, and that can then stand in the way of a positive working relationship, a positive learning partnership, if the student feels that they are intruding on the supervisor's time. So again, this is an important part of the planning, the preparation. Then the next issue I want to mention is a balanced workload. This can go wrong in either direction. What I've come across when placements go wrong is sometimes it's a case of the supervisor not giving the student sufficient work to do under supervision. The fear is that if they give the student too much work or work that's too difficult, then the problems will come back to haunt the supervisor. But in those circumstances, if the student doesn't have enough work to do, they can easily get bored. They can also get an unrealistic picture of what it's like to be a social worker, because in my experience, certainly, it's very rare that a social worker is bored. It's usually the other way, where they've got too much to do, not too little. So avoiding giving the student too little work to do, but also avoiding going to the other extreme, that unfortunately at times supervisors can see the student as a useful assistant, as an extra pair of hands, as it were. And that can result then in the student being overloaded with either too much work or work that's too difficult for them at that stage in their development. So an important part of the planning, an important part of the preparation for an effective placement is to consider what sort of workload is suitable for a student with this level of experience, this level of confidence, and at this stage in the course of their studies. So a balanced workload is a key part. Preparing for that, planning for that is a key part. And on the subject of workload as well, I think it's important that there should be opportunities for project work. It's common for supervisors to give students a certain number of cases for them to manage, either on their own or jointly with the supervisor or jointly with a supervisor's colleague. But that can then restrict, it can narrow the students' opportunities for learning. So what I've been teaching student supervisors to do for many years now is to think of one or two projects that the student can get involved with. A common one, for example, that tends to be widely used is to ask the student to undertake a demographic analysis of the area that the team covers. So to work out what is the ethnic mix, for example, of that particular area. What is the mix in that area in terms of income and wealth? What percentage of the population in that area is registered as disabled? What is the age profile of that area? For example, the number of older people in that area, is that the national average, or is it particularly high or particularly low in that area? Giving students the task of finding that information and presenting it to a team meeting is something I found to be an excellent learning opportunity. But that's just one example, a demographic analysis. There are all sorts of other possibilities. So in terms of, again, preparation and planning for an effective placement, some thought needs to be given to can there be one or more projects that the student can be involved in to broaden their learning and to give them a wider picture of what social work is all about. Then next on my list is the importance of constructive feedback. If the student is going to maximize their learning, then the supervisor needs to be prepared to give them regular and direct feedback on their performance. As I often put it on courses I've run for student supervisors, the student should know when they're doing well, because you should be telling them that they're doing well. When they are struggling, they should know they are struggling, because you should be telling them that they are struggling. And so this regular feedback is an important part of the learning process. Unfortunately, I've come across situations where this hasn't happened, and it gets towards the end of the placement when the student is being told that they are likely to fail the placement because their learning has not been sufficient. But they were not aware of this. They were not made aware of what they were doing wrong, where they were making mistakes or whatever. So regular, balanced feedback has to be built in to the planning and the preparation and the exercise of a practice placement, because without that, there will be all sorts of problems. Students need to know where they stand. They will then be more confident. They'll be better equipped to learn, and it makes life easier for the supervisor as well. in the sense that there are no surprises, no terrible shocks towards the end of the placement. And then that brings me to my final point, which is transparency in the event of actual or potential failure. Perhaps the worst thing that can happen for a student is to think they're doing okay, to think that they're going to pass the placement and proceed to the next stage of their course, only to be told towards the end of their placement that that's not the case, that they haven't met the learning outcomes for the placement, that the level of their practice has not been sufficiently good, and so on. So this is another reason why regular, balanced feedback, positives and negatives, needs to be part of it. But in the case, which thankfully in my experience is relatively rare, in the case that a student is failing, then that needs to be made aware, made clear to them. They need to be aware of it at a fairly early stage, certainly by the halfway point in a placement. If there are concerns that the student isn't going to achieve the required outcomes, then they need to be aware of that, and they need to be aware of the remedial action. What I mean by that is they need to be precisely aware of what is it they need to do differently, what is it they need to do better, where is it that they are not reaching the standards expected of them at that stage in their development. And of course, what's expected of them will be different depending on whether they're first year, second year, third year, and so on. But there should be clear expectations, and if those expectations not being met, the sooner that's addressed, the better. For example, a lot of students have said to me over the years, before going on placement, they've said, but what if I am not good enough? What if I'm not able to reach the level required of me? What should I do? And my answer to that has always been the same, is that you need to be clear about what precisely is it that is deemed to be not of a sufficient standard, and then work with your supervisor, because they're there to help you, and work with your supervisor to be clear and explicit about what needs to improve. For example, if it's an issue around values, if the students' values are creating difficulties in terms of the work that they are doing, if they are perhaps being judgmental, for example, then instead of leaving that towards the end of the placement and then the student supervisor saying, I'm sorry, but you're going to fail this placement because you are not suitably non-judgmental for a social worker. What should be happening is, as soon as there is any evidence of that student being judgmental, the student supervisor needs to address that and say, look, we need to change this, because if you continue to be judgmental, I won't be able to say that you've passed the placement. So let's now sit down and look at what needs to change in terms of your attitude towards people from minority groups, for example, or whatever it is that is the source of the concern around a values issue. So what it's about basically is using that feedback to give the student the opportunity to rectify, to remedy whatever the concerns are, because then the student can quite rightly have no complaints. If they were given the opportunity to address issues and then they didn't do so and they end up failing, then the responsibility is with them. But if they are not given the opportunity to remedy any concerns, then they have grounds for appeal. And certainly in the British system, that is a significant concern, that this can take up a lot of time and effort and create a lot of bad feeling if the student appeals against a decision on the basis that nobody told me there was a problem about X, Y, or Z. So there needs to be this transparency throughout the placement, whereby any concerns about possible failure are raised and dealt with constructively. So those are the 9 areas that I wanted to mention. They're certainly not the only ones. You know, this isn't an exhaustive list. There's so much more that could be said about these issues, but I didn't want to overload you with too much information all at once, because I know that's not helpful. But I hope what I have said is helpful, and thank you once again for inviting me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.